Thanks to everyone who's joining and sharing their name and organization in the chat. We're just going to give it another 1 or 2 minutes because I know we had a lot of people register for this event, and we're probably about halfway there from everyone who said they'd be joining us. So I just want to give another minute or two.
As you're introducing yourself and putting your name and affiliation in the chat, please also put in where you're from. It's so interesting to see people from all over the country. It's great.
Okay, we'll give it just 1 more minute. Anna Rose, I'm just going to ask if you wouldn't mind watching the weight room when I start my introduction, just so I don't have to split my vision between my notes and the weight room box.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. All right, it is 1:05, so we are going to get started. Good afternoon and happy National Food Waste Prevention Week. And for those of you in the DC metro area, we are also observing DMV Food Recovery Week. We are happy to have so many local partners as well as new colleagues from across the country joining us today. I am Anne-Marie Hart Bookbinder, Food Security Programs Manager at the Montgomery County Food Council, and I'm thrilled to facilitate today's webinar, Erase the Doubt About Food Safety, with our partners from Manna Food Center and Community Food Rescue. Improper food storage conditions and confusion about food labeling are major contributors to food waste, as well as wasted dollars and resources. So it's really important to learn what consumers like ourselves can do to help solve the problem. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Food Council's work, I'm just going to briefly share my screen with one slide. And I'm sorry, Jenna, this is going to stop you from sharing for just a moment, but we'll just do that. The Food Council is a nonprofit organization that serves as the primary connection point for businesses, nonprofits, government agencies, and residents around food systems in our county. Our mission is to build an equitable, resilient, and sustainable local food system through collaboration, transformation, and cultivation. We do that through a number of convenings on such topics as food security and advocacy. We have collaborations around gardening, SNAP, and sustainability. And we have a policy priority working groups, 2 of them, that focus on local food procurement and affordable land access for food production. Our website is located there, and I will be sharing it in the chat. For those of you in Montgomery County, Maryland, if you are not already connected with us, please do so. And for those of you across the country, if you're just interested in what is happening in other parts of the world, feel free to connect with us there as well. We have many in-person events, trainings, again, collaboration meetings and newsletters that we are happy to share with you. I'm going to stop sharing there. Okay, just a few brief housekeeping notes. We are recording today's program and we will post it on the DMV Food Recovery Week and Montgomery County Food Council websites. We will hold taking questions until the end of the presentation, but please do enter your questions in the chat as you have them, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. I will be keeping everyone but our presenters on mute until it is time for questions, so please feel free to reach out to me via the chat personally if you're experiencing any technical issues. Those of you who joined us early, many of you already started doing that, but if you haven't already, please introduce yourself and include your organization and what city and state you are from in the chat. And I will now turn things over to Jenna Umbriak.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Can you hear me okay?
Great, and hopefully you cannot hear my dog snoring in the background. My name is Jenna Umbriak. I am a registered dietitian and proud to serve as the Director of Programs at Manna Food Center, also in Montgomery County, Maryland. And I'm going to be, I forgot that I wasn't sharing my screen. Anna Rose, please move on to the next slide. For those of you in the audience, I'm going to be saying spring every time I would like Anna Rose to advance the slide, just to celebrate the season that we're in. Certainly right over here in Maryland, it's beautiful and blooming. Thanks, Anna Rose. So a little bit about Manna Food Center, just to ground you in who we are and why we're talking about this today. Manna Food Centers actually are marking our 40th year this year of pursuing our mission to eliminate hunger in Montgomery County through food distribution, education, and advocacy. The easiest way to describe Manna is to say we're the county designated food bank for Montgomery County. Montgomery County has nearly 1.1 million residents, with an estimated 11% experiencing food insecurity. I always like I always like the fact that we are called a center because of the way that we try to do our work through partnerships. Many of the partners I see on this call, so thank you for joining. And the fact that we have an array of food access initiatives. Spring. So just to give you a quick look at our size and scope, here's Manna by the numbers. Last year, we worked with nearly 38,000 county residents and distributed over 3.8 million pounds of food. We worked with 32 farms, held 123 cooking classes. We helped 372 households apply for SNAP benefits and distributed nearly 86,000 weekend bags through our local public school system. Many of the school system partners are on this call, so hello. Most relevant for this presentation, we administer a coordinated food recovery system for the county, and Cheryl's going to talk in more detail about that in a second. But I will say that our food recovery is guided by food safety parameters that we developed in concert with the county health department. We used parts of this slide deck along with instructional videos that you can find on the CFR website to educate members of our community food rescue network, and we've been using them for years. So we've built on those educational tools to bring you today's presentation. Before we dig into food safety, to provide a bit more background on community food rescue, I'm gonna turn it over to Program Director Cheryl Collin. Spring.
Thanks, Jenna. Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to see so many people from all over the world. I think I saw someone from Greece join us. I'm so excited. So welcome to everybody. My name is Cheryl Collin. I'm the Program Director of Community Food Rescue, which is a program of Manna Food Center. This month, April, marks our 9th year in operation. And we started 9 years ago, really as a program of Manna's to pick up smaller quantities of food directly from food businesses. We use a matching app called Chow Match, which is a proprietary software based in San Francisco. Some of you on this call perhaps also use it. And we like to think of our Community Food Rescue Network as the lift of food recovery. So we do this wonderful matching of food donor businesses that have surplus food that is unsold but still good to eat. We match that using the Chow Match app, and then we are able to match that with food assistance providers. And we have volunteer food runners who deliver that food directly from the food donor businesses to the food assistance providers. In these 9 years, we have been able to rescue and distribute 8 million pounds of food. And in our network, we have grown to over 500 members representing food donor businesses, food assistance providers, and volunteer food runners. Spring. So today we want to focus on the notion of food safety, and particularly for the home consumer, as well as those who might be involved with food recovery around the country and perhaps the world. So you may know this phrase, this term, when in doubt, throw it out. But really, is that the best guide for determining food safety? So we want to really help you to think about what really is food safety. We want you to erase some of the doubt around whether food is safe to eat. So for instance, today we're going to be talking about, should you consume food from dented cans? And how important is the date on that carton of eggs? So really being able to more confidently answer these timeless and important questions can help us both save money and protect the environment. We'll also provide some tips on what to do with safe but surplus food. Spring. So when you think about foods, what foods do you tend to waste the most often? And if you would, go ahead and put your answers in the chat and we can just see what people are thinking. So we're seeing answers like bread, half and half, produce, spinach, more bread, berries, produce, vegetables, greens, fruit, milk, greens, produce, leftovers. All right, great answers. Spring. So with those answers, what is the main reason why food might be wasted in your household? Go ahead and put that in the chat. I'm seeing forgot to cook it, forgot about it, not using it in a timely manner, improper storage, not cooking as much, lack of time, spoils quickly, forgot about it, did not menu plan. Okay, really great answers there. Too lazy. And our last question is, how do you know if food is safe to eat or needs to be discarded? Go ahead and put that in the chat. So I'm seeing someone say smell, appearance, mold, taste bad, sight. Looking at the dates, changes color, looks rotten. Try the use by, sell by dates. Okay, these are all really great answers. And this is really where we're gonna take our launching point for this whole webinar. So really, you cannot see, smell, or taste many harmful bacteria that cause foodborne illness. So really, the most important thing to do is to follow food safety procedures for food storage and preparation. So we're going to talk about how food becomes unsafe in a second. And I noticed that some of you mentioned using the date on the food package to make this decision. And we're going to talk about whether that's a good way to tell or not. I'm going to turn it back over to Jenna.
Thanks, Cheryl, and thanks everybody for those thoughts. I would just ask you to please continue to use the chat throughout, of course, to ask questions, but also to offer your own tips. I heard in those answers to why food is wasted, I heard a lot of solutions already, even though maybe we're not always so good at carrying them out. And I just saw a lot of expertise in the chat when people introducing themselves. So please feel free to add on to what I'm about to go over. Certainly you can't cover it all today. So as Cheryl mentioned, I think it's important to underscore using your senses is an important way to get clues as to whether a food is safe or whether it needs to be discarded. At the same time, as Cheryl said, you can't see, smell, or taste some of the harmful bacteria that cause foodborne illness. So it's really important, I think, to just pair the two. So we're using our senses as clues, but we're also leaning on what we know about food safety procedures and proper food storage and preparation. And food safety may seem like something reserved for grocery stores or restaurants or other food businesses, but it's really important for everyone who purchases, prepares, and eats food to understand some amount of food safety principles. And the first reason really is to reduce foodborne illness. We don't want to get sick, right? No one on this call does, and we certainly don't want to get other people sick, maybe who are visiting our home, eating the food that we prepare. And foodborne illness, preventing foodborne illness on its own is a good goal. It also is very expensive. The CDC estimates that each year, roughly 1 out of every 6 people in the United States will get sick from a foodborne illness. 128,000 of those will get very sick and actually be hospitalized. and even a few thousand people die every year from foodborne illness. So it is serious. And in terms of the healthcare costs, the Economic Research Service of the USDA calculates the cost of major foodborne illnesses around $17.5 billion every year. So this is a good way to lower those healthcare costs as well. And then, of course, the reason that we're on the call today is that having confidence around food safety can prevent wasting food unnecessarily. ReFed, who I'm sure many of you, if you're interested in this call, may know about, it's a big think tank related to food waste in the country, estimates that consumer awareness campaigns or events like this have the potential to divert 1.3 million tons of wasted food every year. That's an emissions reduction of close to 7.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. So just knowing more about our food has the power to do a lot to prevent food waste. And personally, it saves us money and helps protect the environment as well. So we're going to go over simple, but sometimes I've learned controversial concepts in order from procurement or sourcing of the food, spend a good amount of time on food storage. I saw a lot of that in the chat, and then touch a little bit on food preparation at the end. Speaking of preparation, be prepared for a short quiz at the end of this presentation to test your knowledge. We're going to start with sourcing, so spring. So unless you grow food yourself, which I'm sure many of you do, or pick it up directly from the farmer and have a conversation with them about how they grow food, you don't immediately know as much about how food was grown and harvested and handled when you pick it up at the store. So your tools are the food package itself and the process you use when sourcing to maintain safety. I'm going to show, and actually Anna Rose is going to show, thank you, a brief video that I think just does a really great job in a minute or so to summarize some of the basic tips and food safety concepts around purchasing food.
Large food. Can you hear me? I don't know if this will play out loud, but. This is Brian.
Oh, yep. I think we can hear it.
Okay. Bacteria like Brian love food, but your food doesn't love Brian, and neither does your health. When shopping, pick up dry foods and household goods first. Things like canned fish, rice, lentils, and toothpaste. Brian is not interested in these. Collect your fruit and vegetables next. Brian loves meat, seafood, and dairy, but only when they're warm. He hates the cold, and he can't handle the heat, so it's important to choose hot and cold items last. Otherwise, they may end up at Brian's favorite temperature, above 5 degrees Celsius. Make sure you keep your hot and cold foods separate, or as your cold foods warm up and your hot foods cool down, you'll find yourself taking home some unwanted passengers. You can avoid food poisoning. Shop, store, cook, and eat safely.
Thanks, Anna Rose. I love that video because it's really short, but there's actually so many important basics about food safety crammed into there. And I love this little Brian as the avatar for bacteria, because we're going to reference Brian a lot during the course of the presentation. So just to review what you heard in the video, always pick up your frozen or chilled foods towards the end of your shopping trip. Again, you'll understand better why that is the case later, but it has to do with making sure that foods stay in the right temperature zone. Prevent your meat, chicken, or fish, if you're buying it fresh and raw, from leaking onto other products. So we certainly will talk about cross-contamination in a second. It just means to keep those products separate from things that you'll be eating without preparation. And then wash your reusable shopping bags regularly, especially if you did have an instance where the chicken juice may have gotten on the bag. Spring. So I think that video does a good job of sharing what to do once you get the food in your cart and kind of the order of operations when you're in the grocery store. But before you even take the food off the shelf, it's good to examine it for any of the following signs that it could be unsafe. And this may be less applicable at your local grocery store, where they probably do a good job of screening the food before they stock it. But if you're considering donating food to your local food assistance provider, or if you receive food from an organization that accepts donated or recovered food, this becomes even more important. So as a general rule, discard any food, especially meat, that is slimy or foul smelling. People mentioned smell before in the chat. Cans that are swollen or leaking or stained, rust building up on the outside that makes it seem like they were probably in some sort of water damage. And then dented. So I want to stop here for just a second and just acknowledge that how dented is too dented can be a subjective matter. So at Manna, we use the rule of thumb that if the can is unable to stand up on its own, it's probably too dented. Also, if the dent or dents are on the top or bottom seal of the can, and especially if it's causing the lid or the bottom of the can to be deformed in some way, then it's too dented. In contrast, if this happens all the time when we're at the warehouse, a volunteer or a staff member drops a can on the floor, and we know that the dent came right from that incident, and it's just a little dent on the side of the can. Typically that is fine. Past cans, we're talking about box food. So you want to make sure that if it's a box food with the bag inside, that the bag is sealed. If the box is open, that's okay. But food items that are in boxes where the box is stained or wet, or you can see anything that might resemble webbing, like the webbing of insects or droppings, like rodent droppings. Of course, you would never want to buy food like that. You certainly don't want to donate food that has those signs. And if you encounter it in your own pantry at home, you certainly don't want to eat any of that. So those are all signs that something should really be discarded. Spring. So at least one person mentioned in the chat using the dates on the food packages as a guideline for food safety. And you'll notice I didn't start with checking the dates. I do like to start with, let's look at the package and let's use our senses and what we know first. And that's because in almost every case, the package date is not what we think of. We often call it an expiration date, but it is not that in most cases, and it's not federally regulated. Typically, the date is a measure of quality, but not safety. And sometimes it's really just a tool to keep inventory moving through the system. Federal legislation has been proposed over the years to designate kind of a separate quality date from a date that really means safety, so do not eat after, to reduce confusion around these dates. But to my knowledge, nothing has passed at the national level. If anyone is on the call from Washington State or Massachusetts, I think you all have laws on the books to simplify date labeling at the state level. But nationwide, currently there are probably more than 10 different labels you might see on a package. Sell by, use by, best before, best if used by, best by, you've seen them. And this can result in a lot of confusion around whether a product is safe to eat. So at Manna, we do provide food past the date, and we'll talk in a little bit about how far past date is usually acknowledged as safe. There's a great short film on the topic that kind of came out when we first started making these back in 2016, these presentations by the folks at the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic. It's called Expired. And it's just a great short film that talks a lot about the date, the impact that date labeling has, the confusion around date labeling has. And they also keep that page or the website around that video up to date regarding pertinent legislation. So you can check that out if you're curious about what's going on in that space. So the summary statement about dates on food packages is that as long as the food is stored properly, it is typically safe to consume days, weeks, and depending on the food, sometimes even years past the date on the package. And we'll get to how long in just a second. But first, let's talk about that proper food storage. Spring. So as we saw earlier, Brian, the bacteria, doesn't like the cold or the heat. He likes foods that are kept in a particular temperature range. And we refer to this range as the danger zone. It's really trying to get your attention. The danger zone is between 40 and 140 degrees. You'll note that on my thermometer there on the image, it's 5 degrees lower on the top end and a degree higher on the low end. Some states have used that guideline of 135 and 41, but 40 and 140 is just so much easier to remember, and that's what the USDA uses. So you can typically just use that when you're at home. So as we also saw in the video, Brian doesn't care about all foods. Brian only likes certain foods like meat and dairy. And the foods that need to be kept out of the danger zone, the foods that Brian likes, are called TCS foods, or time temperature control for safety foods. The temperature we just talked about, so again, keeping foods outside of that danger zone of between 140 and 40 degrees. The time piece is essentially how long a food can sit in the danger zone before the number of Brians or the amount of bacteria becomes unsafe. As a general rule, TCS foods should not be left in the danger zone for more than 4 hours. So now let's quickly review which foods need time and temperature control. And Anna Rose wants to get there quick. Let's get there. We can go to that. I love this image. It's a beautiful artistic representation of the TCS foods. So in case you don't remember a long list, you can just kind of picture this image of the tiny little shrimp on top of the lobster, on top of the chicken. So those foods that really are the ones we're going to think about when we think about TCS foods are, again, meat and poultry, dairy products, fish and shellfish, eggs. Tofu and soy is pulled out, cooked potatoes, cut leafy greens, cut tomatoes and melons. So whole leafy greens, whole tomatoes, and whole melons, basically whole fruits and vegetables, not TCS foods. But once you cut those, then they can start growing bacteria, and we want to be careful about how we're storing them. I mean, for quality, you want to be careful about how you're storing whole leafy greens and whole tomatoes and whole melons. But for safety, you don't have to worry about them too much until they are cut. And then cooked things like rice, beans, grains. I mean, basically anything that you've prepared, leftovers, should also be considered TCS foods. So now that we know which foods we have to be careful about and to store properly, what does this mean for actually storing these foods at home? So let's take a look inside the fridge. Spring. So again, you're going to want to keep all of that TCS food at or below 40 degrees if you're storing it in the fridge. If you're cooking it, that's when you start to get at the top end of that, or the higher end of that danger zone, or the temperatures above the danger zone, I'm sorry. So keeping all food at or below 40 degrees. If you have a fridge that has a digital readout, and many of them do now, that's a great way to just keep tabs on, is my fridge at the proper temperature. If your fridge does not have a temperature readout, you may want to consider putting a little thermometer in there in the kind of back in the middle of the fridge to make sure that your fridge is at the proper temperature of 40 degrees or below. And you want to leave space for air to circulate in the fridge. Just don't pack it fully. It really just helps keep everything at the proper temperature. You want to generally, again, we're going to talk about dates more in a second, but just to kind of put this in your mind, we use the rule of thumb at Manna to use pre-prepared foods that we might recover from grocery stores within 5 days of the package date. It's easy to remember. And 5 days is usually a good guideline for most of the salads and sandwiches and things like that. And thank you. Cheryl just put in the chat this little infographic that from the USDA. I think it's just a handy way to remember the basic tips around your fridge and food safety. And finally, the location you store food in your fridge is important. So you'll notice here on the diagram that the doors are typically not considered the best places for those TCS foods. So if you have raw meat or eggs in the fridge, you don't want to store those on the door. You want to store those in the center of the fridge where the temperature is typically more constant. The doors is a great place for condiments or things like that. All right, I think we're ready to move on from the fridge and head on to the freezer. Spring. The freezer, you want to make sure is at or below 0 degrees. Again, if your freezer does not have a temperature readout, you might consider putting a little thermometer in there. Frozen food, the freezer is really our friend when it comes to preventing food waste. Brian hates the freezer. Freezing food stops Brian and bacteria in its tracks. It essentially presses pause on bacterial growth, and you can keep food in the freezer for months and not have to worry about it becoming unsafe. Now, once we thaw the food and we're getting ready to eat it or cook it, then timer starts again and Brian wakes up, and we got to consider the time and temperature control for safety again. But as long as they're in the freezer, Brian is not doing a thing. Yeah, I'm trying not to pay attention to the questions that are popping up in the chat since I know we're going to address them later. But I am going to talk about freezer burn in a second, Sarah. Important to remember FIFO, and this is true. Oh, Anna Rose, thank you. Can you go back one? Thanks. It's important to remember the little acronym FIFO. It's a good mnemonic device for first in, first out. This is good to apply to the freezer, just again, from a quality perspective. Certainly from the fridge, I know that many of you indicated that you often forget about foods, and that's often how they get wasted. So I always like to literally use this FIFO philosophy in my fridge. So I will put the leftovers that I just made, make sure that they are in the back. And I pull the leftovers that were made yesterday or the day before to the front, so that it's less likely that I'm going to forget that one is back there and I haven't seen it and it will go bad before I can use it. And that's a good way to organize your freezer as well as your pantry for that matter. So putting those older foods in the front. Preventing so somebody mentioned freezer burn. So freezer burn is not a safety concern. Freezer burn is really an undesirable texture change, color change that happens when things are frozen very slowly. So you want to freeze things as quickly as possible, which just like with the fridge means don't stuff your freezer. If you put something you want frozen in there from fresh, it's good that it has that space to let the cold air come around it and freeze it more quickly. You're going to get better quality frozen food that way. The other important consideration is what you're packaging it in to freeze it. So you want to make sure you're investing in, whether it's a Ziploc bag or, a stasher bag or something that says that it's good for the freezer. That's going to be important. Just wrapping something in plastic wrap is not going to prevent the freezer burn. You really have to get maybe plastic wrap and then put some tinfoil over it, or plastic wrap and then throw it in a Ziploc bag. So you really want to make sure you're protecting the stuff that's going in the freezer in order to try to prevent that freezer burn. But again, freezer burn, not a safety concern. And the last thing I want to say while we're on this slide is consider storing some things that might not automatically come to mind when thinking about freezer storage in there to also prevent unnecessary food waste. Things like whole grains, nuts, seeds. If you're somebody that shops at in the bulk bin of your grocery store, it's best to keep those foods in the freezer or the fridge to make sure that the fats that are in those whole foods don't go rancid. It's not so much a safety concern. but it is going to make the seeds taste bad or the grains taste bad, and then you might be encouraged to throw them out before they're, before their time. Oh, I also just want to make a case for labeling your food well before you put it in the freezer. I think we've all had that experience of feeling like we're definitely going to get back to that, and we're going to remember in 2 months' time what it is, and we're going to eat it then. But I have certainly had the experience where I pull something out and think, what is this? Whether it's a sauce I don't remember that I made or something like that. So best to just label it with the date that you've put it in the freezer and what it is. That way you can keep tabs on how long it's been in there, and you can make sure that you meal plan for it, in the next week or so. All right, now we're ready to move on from the freezer. I spent a lot of time there. So fresh produce, I think that was the most commonly mentioned food that gets wasted. And really, it's hard to talk about fresh produce and storage because it really depends on what it is. Some fruits and vegetables store best in the refrigerator, but bananas and tomatoes hate the refrigerator, as does things like fresh basil. Some foods like onions, garlic, potatoes, winter squash, those do best in a cool, dark place outside of the fridge, on your counter or in your pantry. So if you really want to get a good look, we recommend this Hungry Harvest produce guide. We partner with Hungry Harvest here at Manna, and they've come up with this great guide that has storage tips for all the produce that you can think of. The last thing I want to say about produce is something to pay attention to that I wasn't aware of until the most recent past is some fruits and vegetables, put out gases to ripen, and that can impact or influence the ripening of other fruits and vegetables that they are near. The best example of this is, or the one I think about the most, is onions and potatoes, because I often store those close to one another on my counter. You don't want to do that. They are going to influence each other to ripen maybe before you're ready to use them. So I don't know if this Hungry Harvest guide talks about those foods, but that's something to definitely look into, is which of the fruits and vegetables shouldn't be stored close to each other. All right, spring. And finally, for canned and boxed foods, simple concepts like don't store your food on the floor. And this is something that we talk about a lot at food service establishments. The health department's always making sure that we have, at least 6 inches from the bottom shelf there to the floor. The temperature for the best temperature for dry goods is typically around 50 to 70 degrees. And people mentioned bread in the chat. I noticed it's things that go to waste. So my rule of thumb is I buy the bread fresh, I'll eat it that evening or the evening after, and then I put it right in the freezer. If it's not sliced, I'll slice it first, because it's just easier to take out a few pieces that way rather than have to defrost the whole thing again. So the typical rule of thumb is if you won't eat the bread in about 2 days, wrap it tightly again with with wrap or with a bag that's meant to be in the freezer, and you can store it up for 3 months in the freezer. So again, the freezer is really your friend when you're trying to reduce food waste at home. All right, spring. So now that we've talked a bit about how to store foods, let's discuss how long you can store them for. So remember that most foods remain very edible, even well after the date on the package. How long after depends on the food. But here's a quick sampling of some of the foods that we most encounter at Manna. And you may find different ranges depending on the source that you're looking at, but the general idea is that the date isn't the whole truth. So, and most of the time I don't see, enormous differences in the range. So I think these are typically a good rule of thumb, and these come right from the FDA and the USDA. So for again, for leftovers or for those salads or sandwiches that you got from the deli department of the grocery store, typically 5 days is the limit on those. Milk is good up to a week past that date. And of course, you can tell when milk has gone rancid because you can smell it. But actually, milk that has turned sour is still safe to consume as long as you've stored it in the refrigerator in the proper temperature. Now you have buttermilk and you can bake with it. Yogurt's already fermented, so it actually lasts quite a much longer. I would even go further than 10 days. The yogurt will just change in terms of quality and the amount of fermented flavor it imparts. Eggs are good for several weeks past the date on the food package. We've already talked about frozen food. For dry goods, people are always kind of amazed at this, but canned foods, especially what are called low acid canned goods, or things like canned tuna or canned green beans or peas or things like that, they're good up to 3 years past. And that's actually, I think, a conservative estimate. I think that the USDA might even go so far as to say 5 years past. You know, of course, the quality is going to change over the time span. So, you know, if you open a canned food 5 years after, don't expect it to be exactly like it would be the day you bought it, or the day it was canned, I should say. But still safe as long as the can doesn't look bulging or swollen at all. It's been stored at a proper temperature. It's not been through any sort of fire or flood. This is typically, and I've tested it out at Manna. I've taken a can of tuna home that was certainly 5 years, maybe more, just to see, and it was perfectly fine. I think we'll move on from this. These guys are available everywhere. Somebody asked if this particular image could be linked to, we will find that, but these dates are available many, many places. All right, thank you, Anna Rose. So we're gonna end on preparation. And we've talked about purchasing and procuring food as well as storing food. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to keep food safe when you're ready to use it. So the 3 components I want to talk about here are personal hygiene, cross-contamination, and just touch again on time and temperature control really quickly. String. So most important thing about food preparation in order to prevent foodborne illness is to use good personal hygiene. It's really the most important tool you have. Many of the bacteria, like Brian, that can lead to foodborne illness are found on our bodies, on our hair, on our skin, mouth, nose, and throat, even of healthy people. So certainly if you're sick, you should be extra careful. And if you work in an environment where you handle food and you're sick, don't handle the food. But everyone should be washing their hands beforehand. And again, if you sneeze or cough or you touch your face or you touch your hair, wash again before you start handling food. Just a quick note on hand sanitizers. They're never a replacement for washing your hands. Of course, in a pinch, it's all you've got, it's all you've got, but they don't really do exactly the same thing. All right. Preventing, Anna Rose is going to have to hear spring anymore. She's just ready to go. Preventing cross-contamination. So cross-contamination is when our TCS Foods in particular, meat and raw meat and fish and poultry get in contact with ready-to-eat foods. So foods we are not going to cook before we eat them. And even if it's broccoli or something you're going to cook to a certain temperature, it's best to keep the meat and seafood and poultry totally separate from those vegetables when you're preparing food. The best way to do this, and so you can learn from the example on this image, and we can go to the next slide, is to use different cutting boards for both. So you have your meat and fish and poultry cutting board, and you've got your vegetable and fruit cutting boards, and never the twain shall meet. you want to, what I find interesting about this, so the principles are the same, whether you're talking about how to prevent cross-contamination on the cutting board surface, or if you think about taking that food from the grocery store, you don't want to put your, raw chicken breasts right on top of your, I'm going to keep using broccoli, it's my favorite vegetable, right on top of the broccoli. You want to keep those separate. And in the refrigerator, the same concept applies. You want to keep those, maybe you have some fish defrosting in the refrigerator. We'll talk about defrosting in a second. You certainly don't want to lay that right on top or even put it on the shelf above foods like your lettuce or your herbs and things like that. You want to be sure that it is on the lowest shelf of the refrigerator so that you don't have that possibility that the juice from the meat is going to drip down onto some of the other foods. And then this also will reflect the temperatures that we cook foods to. So you can see that fish is on the top, and then we make our way through ground meats into chicken. When in a moment, when we talk about what temperature you're supposed to cook those foods to, this is the same. So the lowest temperature for fish, and then it gets higher as you go down to poultry. So it's just an easy way that I think it's easy to remember that the concepts are really the same. So you don't have to feel like you're memorizing a whole bunch of just random numbers. If you can think about these general principles about which foods are kind of the most dangerous and which foods are less so. All right, I mentioned you might have some fish defrosting in your fridge, because the fridge is the best way and the safest way to defrost your frozen food before you're going to use it. So it does involve planning. This is the biggest gripe people have with this method, is you do have to think about it, in some cases a couple of days ahead, depending on what you're thawing out. For something like fish or chicken breast, typically the night before, you can put it in the fridge, again, on that lowest rung of the fridge, so it's not going to drip on anything else. And then the next day you have it already thawed for you for your use. If you didn't plan, there are two other ways that it is safe to defrost food. One is in the microwave. If you do this method, you do have to cook it fully right after you microwave it. And the challenge here is that sometimes you end up starting to cook it in the microwave. But that is a safe way to do it. And then the other is in cold water. So this is put the food wrapped up in a Ziploc bag or similar contraption in the cold water, and then replace the cold water every 30 minutes until the thing is thawed out. So it does involve a little bit more water usage, and it does involve a little bit more paying attention to the time that you've got it in that bowl or container. But please do not thaw your food, meat in particular, fish, on the counter. Every time I go home, my mother's doing it. I feel my dietitian heart just starts to crumble a little bit. All right, moving on from here, we're going to finish up with a note on how to safely cook the item. So we've defrosted it safely, we use the right cutting board, etc. And then we're going to cook it to a particular temperature. So my meat thermometer is like my favorite thing to use in the kitchen. I keep it, it's magnetized, it's right on my fridge. I use it mostly for fish. I don't eat a lot of meat in my kitchen at home, but this is really the only way to know if you've cooked the food to its proper temperature. And again, these are those TCS Foods, time temperature control for safety foods. And you can look just anywhere, Google proper temperature for food, go to the USDA website. And the least risky foods are those chops or roasts or fillets or breasts. And then as the food gets ground, it gets a little bit more dangerous. So the temperature goes up. That's how I kind of remember it. So once you've taken a piece of meat and you've ground it up, there's a lot more chance for bacteria that was on the surface there to get all mixed up in the middle. And so you want to cook your ground meats to a higher temperature, 165, than you would your steak, for instance. but you can look those up. And if I have a second, I'll put them in the chat right when I'm done. All right, so I've talked through a lot and somewhat quickly. I know we have lots of questions in the chat that we want to get to, but first, we are going to ask you some questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl to take us through a quick quiz so you can test your knowledge of what we just went over.
Thank you, Jenna, and a wonderful array of information, a lot of great information. And thanks to Anne-Marie, who's recording this, so that if you want to review it or share it with other people. But we thought it would be great to reinforce the concepts that Jenna just gave us by offering you a little quiz. Now, you won't be graded, but it'll be fun to see how much you actually know or have learned today. So if you want to, please put your answers in the chat. And our first question is, what is the shelf life of cereal? And you can see the 4 options. So go ahead and fill that in, and we'll see what the general feeling is before we reveal the answer. Okay, I'm saying 1 to 2 years, 1 to 2 years. Yes. Spring. Yes, it is 1 to 2 years past the date on the package. So that just really reinforces that the package dates are not, that you have to throw out the packaged food immediately when that date appears. And I know that there are often fights in families about what that date labeling means. So now you have the authority of Jenna and lots of other folks who tell you that you can keep foods past the package date. Okay, next slide. What is the shelf life of refrigerated eggs? So here are your choices. Go ahead and put your answer in the chat. We'll see what people think. Okay, we are seeing several different answers, but most people are getting it correct, which is 3 to 5 weeks. So that always surprised me. I had no idea eggs could live that long and be still good to consume. As long as they are kept in the refrigerator. Next slide. So what happens after the use by, sell by, or best by date? After that date passes? Which answer would you choose here? Yes, we have a very talented audience today. All of the above. Yes, so we know that food will may lose some quality, may lose some nutritional value, but food is still safe to eat. Next slide, please. All right, this gets into that TSC concepts that Jenna talked about, time and temperature control for safety. So what is an example of a food that needs time and temperature control for safety? Which of these foods? All right, again, most people are putting in sliced tomatoes. That's correct. As Jenna mentioned earlier, that if you have a whole fruit or vegetable, say if those tomatoes were whole, that would not be considered a TSC food. And likewise, breads are not considered TSC foods. Any unopened jars of food are not TSC foods. Next, please. How long can a TCS food be out of temperature control before it must be discarded? And I'm seeing the numbers come into the chat. Very good. 4 hours. Yes. Very good. Of course, you need to consider the season. I mean, if you're at a picnic and it's hot and humid and you've got some TCS foods sitting out there, I probably would not use that 4 hours. I'd probably go shorter than that. So you have to use your common sense also. All right, next. Which of these foods is a TCS food? Looking at the chat, yes, we see a couple of good answers. Cooked green beans is the answer. Absolutely. Again, Bananas, we're assuming that they have been unpeeled. Canned foods are not, and cookies are shelf-stable foods, so they're not as well. And what is not an acceptable way to thaw frozen food? Very good, you're correct, room temperature. Jenna went over the 3 ways that you can safely thaw food in your refrigerator, your microwave, or immersed in cold water, assuming that you change the water every 30 minutes. So those are all good, acceptable ways. At room temperature is not. And I agree, Jenna, my mom did it at room temperature too. So I think that's just old school and not a good thing. Okay, next. Which of these is not a food safety concern? Very good. Yes, the answers coming in are correct. Eating food past the sell-by date. So we've talked a lot about what those sell-by dates mean. Really a reflection of quality, but not food safety. We've talked about some of those guidelines of when food is still safe to eat. So good job. And next slide. So what can I do with leftover food from a party? Okay, I'm seeing some of the answers come in correctly, all of the above. So let's look a little bit closer at this answer. So yes, donate it with the caveat that if it was prepared by a licensed business or caterer and not already served to the public. Now, these are Montgomery County, Maryland food safety guidelines that we follow. Your local food safety guidelines might be different, but this seems to be a really good rule of thumb to do. With leftover food from a party, certainly freeze it. Jenna says freezers are our friends and use it later. So especially if this was prepared by you, if you have extra food, you might want to give it to some of your guests to take home. And that way you don't have a ton of that food in your freezer. And then lastly, if you have to throw it away, if it's been sitting out more than 4 hours or less on a hot day, you do need to discard it. We certainly encourage, whenever possible, to compost that food. Some cities you can, you have curbside composting already. In others, you might be able to take it to a facility, or in my case, I can sign up with a subscription and have my compost picked up at the curbside every week. So that's what you can do with leftover food.
Great. Well, everyone did a wonderful job on that quiz. And I got a chance to look at some of the questions that we'll answer in a second. First, just want to build on something that Cheryl mentioned during the last quiz question. And I find it best to illustrate, you can go back to the food recovery hierarchy. Thank you. I like to use this hierarchy that the EPA developed. We've used it when we first created Community Food Rescue and thinking through what were the different strategies we were going to use to help reduce food waste in the county. And of course, the first, we talked a lot about, I think maybe we were talking mostly in this area of the hierarchy, which is source reduction. So first trying to reduce the amount that you buy that you don't think you're going to use. People mentioned meal planning from the get-go. It's something that, really, really helps in this regard. I know it does take time to do, but first trying to reduce the amount. I mean, it's the same with the way we learned about recycling as kids, right? Reduce was always the very first, the first R, right? And so it's certainly the first thing here as well. the next is to feed hungry people, and that's great. I mean, we work for an organization that certainly tries to improve people's food access, and one of the ways we do that is by using donated and recovered food. My ask to all of you is just, when considering donating surplus food, consider other people's health and safety as well. And so look to the organization that you're considering donating to. Many have a most needed food list. They have learned over time what the people who are seeking food assistance want, and can guide you in terms of your donations as it relates to health, promoting health for the community, and also considering people's cultural backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. So, and don't donate anything too far past the date. So we learned what those general guidelines are for how far past date food is safe to consume. So don't go further than that, and pay attention to what those items are. So for things like, you know, a bag of rice or a bag of beans or pasta, a box of pasta, you certainly want to be within that first year if you're going to be donating it. And then please don't donate anything that's been opened already, or even if you tape it shut or put a rubber band around it. I've seen all kinds of you know, well-meaning donations at the food bank, but we certainly can't use any of that food based on these guidelines that we've talked about today. Finally, you go to feed animals next. If you have a farmer friend, see if they want any food scraps for their animals. And if you don't, as Cheryl said, we do encourage composting. I did put a link in the chat that has a great list by state of where you might compost, or look for your local composting pickup. And then you know, as we all know, we've all been interested in this topic of food waste prevention. Making the landfill the destination of last resort when it comes to food is the goal, right, for all of this. So use that little guideline. We do use it here. And then we just want to make sure you're aware of some resources that we have on the Community Food Rescue website. I don't know, Cheryl, you want to outline a couple of them?
I want to just invite folks to visit our website, communityfoodrescue.org, and we'll have that in the next slide. But this is a great threefold brochure that really covers a lot of the information that we spoke about today in terms of how to store food safely, thaw it, cook it, and so on. So it's on our website. It's in PDF form. It's easy to download, and it's in 6 different languages. So we welcome everybody to use it, share it, and it's great for the home consumer. It's great if you happen to work with food assistance provider, because a lot of end consumers have questions about food safety, what those date labels mean, and so on. So this is really great information for that. Next slide. And just again, want to invite folks to visit our website, communityfoodrescue.org. We have videos, we have brochures, we have a whole set of food safety guidelines if you're looking to create your own and don't have any. These have been vetted by our county's Department of Health and Human Services, and it's particularly for recovered food. So it's a great resource for you. So we want to say thank you so much for coming. We are ready to take your questions, and I'm going to turn it back to Anne Marie to facilitate that, and we can take questions.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much to Jenna and to Cheryl for a really great and thorough presentation. And with all that, we still have some great questions in the chat. So Kathy is asking if the 4 hours for how long a food item being left out, if that is cumulative. So for instance, if an item is out for 2 hours and then put back in the fridge until tomorrow, does the time reset?
Yes. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, from a quality perspective, you want to refrain from continually reheating and then cooling foods, and then it just sort of gets iffy in terms of any one person's ability to keep track of all that and all the temperatures. So my recommendation is to, once you've thawed something out or cooked it, and just refrigerate it one time and then eat it the next time you take it out of that fridge. Anne Marie's nodding, so
I mean, also full disclosure, but as Jenna well knows, I'm also a registered dietitian. And I think if you've ever seen dates that seem confusing to you, like the USDA says something is good for 3 to 4 days, that's where that flexibility comes in, right? So if you are constantly taking something out, for 2 hours, putting it back, taking it out for 2 hours, putting it back, it's probably not going to last as long as something that is just making, one trip out, even if it's after 2 days or something. So I think that's where you need to keep that flexibility.
Yeah. Think about how you feel after a long line of connecting flights.
Okay. And Jenna, you already answered the question about freezer burns, so we're good there. What about washing fruits and vegetables? There have been many foodborne outbreaks linked to fresh produce and can be spread by eating or cutting unwashed produce.
Yeah, well, I'm a fan of just the general rinse. I don't personally use any of the products that are on the market that claim to be produce. I shouldn't say claim to be, maybe are produce cleaners. My understanding is that most of the foodborne illnesses that come from foods being washed like that are happening at the large end of the food chain, if you will. So at big manufacturing plants or processing plants where the food is being touched by lots of different hands, or may come from a contaminated water source or something like that. So at the home, I just look for rinsing any visible debris off of the fruits and vegetables before I use them.
Just want to also emphasize that I've been told not to wash poultry.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Because that causes cross-contamination in your sink and wherever water splashes onto your countertops and so on. So if you're wondering about whether you should be washing that turkey or that whole chicken before you cook it, do not.
Mm-hmm.
And also not for safety purposes, but for longevity, you don't want to be washing off your produce until you're just getting ready to use it. So particularly berries, a lot of people have a fondness for rinsing off berries before they put them in the refrigerator. That is basically a way of ensuring that they are going to go bad pretty quickly. So you want to make sure you're rinsing right before you use.
Mm-hmm.
Just a sanity check question. You can freeze eggs. That was
Did you say a sanity?
That was in the chat.
You can freeze eggs. And actually, I'm going to put in the chat what I think is a great idea about how to freeze eggs, because when you think about freezing them whole in the shell, that feels just risky to me. The shell's going to break. So this person has a great idea about freezing them in little muffin tins. So but yes, you can. The USDA says thumbs up on freezing eggs.
Great. Someone asked about when are cooking classes and when are the farmers markets. Now I put in the chat a link to the dates and locations for 2023's Montgomery County's farmers markets, if that's what you were referring to. When are cooking classes? I'm just wondering, maybe this is someone thinking about Manna's cooking classes in particular.
I actually
Sure. And sorry.
Oh, sorry, Anna Rose.
I just put the link in the chat for our community food education team's page on the Manna website. So you can find more information about cooking classes and other food education activities we have on that page.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Anna Rose. I wasn't scrolling ahead, so I didn't lose track of the question.
No worries.
For raw meat, do you recommend plastic cutting boards over wood to be able to place it in the dishwasher?
Oh, yeah. If you're going to put your cutting boards in the dishwasher, I would recommend plastic over wood. I mean, wood has you know, we all hate, well, I shouldn't say that. I hate plastic, maybe not everybody on this. I mean, it certainly has its benefits. Wood is tricky as a cutting board because they do tend to crack, and then you've got bacteria building up in those little nooks and crannies that are hard to wash. So I recommend, it doesn't have to be plastic, but there's lots of different composites that they make cutting boards out of now that are not going to crack like wood. So I do recommend going that direction with your cutting boards. But yeah, wood would not do great in the dishwasher.
Any recommendations for a good thermometer?
I have the one at home that I like. I don't even remember the brand, but it's magnetic. So it sticks on the fridge, which is great because out of sight, out of mind, right? But if it's on my fridge, whenever I'm getting that thing out of the refrigerator, I see it. I'll put in the chat, again, sort of the USDA has a good guide for different types of thermometers. I don't think you can go wrong as long as you're sure that your thermometer is calibrated. So if you do have one of those older style like stem thermometers, especially one with like the manual little readout, kudos to you if you're still using one of those. But they do require a different calibration technique than the digital readout thermometers. So mine also charges, doesn't need it like has a little like micro USB port. So I like that one, but somebody wanted to add something and I'll put that in the chat, the link.
Yeah, this is Cheryl. I was going to add, make sure it's an instant read thermometer to be distinguished between the kinds of thermometers that you stick into, say, a roast, and that goes into the oven, and then it will register the temperature there. My son-in-law got the two confused, and he put an instant read thermometer into the oven, and of course it melted. So make sure you know what you're doing.
We live, we learn.
That's really, there's so much collective knowledge on this call, I'm sure, from things just like that.
Someone was asking if this presentation was available in Spanish. Unfortunately, this is not. This is, you know, as it's happening live. But Cheryl, are any of the resources on your website available in Spanish?
Absolutely. That food safety brochure, as I mentioned, is in 6 different languages, including Spanish. So certainly take advantage of that.
I would also just say that at MANA, we have certainly used different food safety trainings that are not unique to Montgomery County, but companies like Premier Food Safety, I get no money from them, but they do have Spanish language courses for food handlers or food service managers. So if you're really interested, that is a resource that exists.
There is also a website called, I'll put the link in the chat, fightback.org, which has a lot of information about food safety. And I would assume that there are some Spanish resources on there as well. So we'll include that. This may have already been followed up if there was a link to the shelf life graphic from earlier.
I believe Anna Rose put that in.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. Reusable silicone bags for the freezer.
Yeah. Yes, in that I've used them and I find that they work pretty well. The like Stasher brand bags are the ones that I tend to use. Yes, and they don't necessarily say, like I said earlier, that they're like marked for the freezer, but they do tend to work fairly well, especially when you maybe like double up with like a rubber band that's wrapped around the like plastic that they come in, if they come in plastic. But yes to those.
Great. And thanks to Daniela for sharing a link to eatortoss.com as another resource for produce. How long do you think baked goods would last in the freezer?
So normally what I've seen is and it depends what you mean by last, I guess is the question. So if we're talking food safety, you can keep them in there forever. I mean, they'll still be safe to consume, but after a certain amount of, typically like around the 3 or 4 month mark, depending again on what it is, they just won't taste as great once you thaw them. So hard to say. I would imagine something that's like a heartier bread would do well longer in the freezer than say something like a croissant or a sweet roll or something like that, that's going to just be more fragile.
I'm seeing just a statement about prepackaged lettuce saying washed and ready to use. I'm guessing you meant about, I'm guessing, Laura, that you meant about whether you should wash it or not. I will say my own experience, if I am home, I will re-rinse it. If I am out somewhere, or if we're doing a food demonstration or we're out at an event, I would trust it as okay. But when possible, I would still give that a rinse from the bagged lettuces and such. Let's see. All right, so we have the cooking classes. That's great. Ice cube trays for eggs.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
We can email the recording out, the link to the recording to the attendance list. So yes, you will get that. Daniela, thank you. We'd be happy to have you present in Spanish in the future. And for food storage, other than plastic wrap or plastic bags, can you safely wash and reuse plastic bags? And if you have any other recommendations besides plastic bags for storage.
Yeah, well, again, I use a lot of glass containers that are not all of them very good for the freezer. So you do have to sometimes through trial and error, see which ones work pretty well to be frozen and which ones don't. And then again, those silicone bags we've mentioned a couple of times, especially good for the freezer if you don't want to use glass for those. In terms of rewashing plastic bags, I feel like there's probably like a USDA answer to this, and then there's my answer to this, which is that I reuse my plastic bags. I wash them with dish soap and then I set them out to dry thoroughly. What I would advise against is putting them away somewhere when they're still wet, because then you are going to welcome a lot of Bryans that are going to love that moist, warm environment. So I think as long as you're washing them thoroughly and drying them thoroughly before next use, you're probably good to go.
Any other questions? I don't see any more in the chat. I will just say two quick things I made a note of during the presentation when we were talking about dairy. Look for mold. That is your big one. If yogurt or milk has mold in it, for sure that it has gone past the point of no return.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because people often ask about cheese and the difference between soft cheeses and hard cheeses. So for typically the rule of thumb is like, if it's a soft cheese where the mold can easily make its way through the whole piece, you got to get rid of it. But if it's something like a Parmesan or a Romano, or you can tell I'm Italian because that's the only hard cheeses I can think of. But I'm sure there are others. And you see some mold on the surface, you can cut that piece off and that is fine.
I was laughing because like you, Jenna, Parmesan and pecorino does not last long enough in my house.
Manchego, is that hard enough? And that's the rule of thumb as well. So things like, even if it's a tomato sauce and you see the mold on the top, like you don't know how far through that's gone. So that's something you're going to have to toss. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for bringing that up.
Yeah. And then just one last thing for defrosting meat. Something I use is I put it on an aluminum pan in the refrigerator. It actually helps it defrost faster because the pan gets warmer, more like the temperature of the refrigerator, and that transfers directly to the meat. We don't need to get into the science, but it works. But what it also gives you is that benefit of nothing, if there is a leak in the package, it will then not get all over the rest of your refrigerator. And if you're like me and you have a refrigerator that inconveniently puts all the produce at the bottom and you don't have much choice but to put your defrosting meat right above that, that's a great item for peace of mind.
In my next life, I am going to invent a different refrigerator. I want one that can hold the amount of produce that I like to keep in my fridge. It's like the produce was an afterthought. Like, oh, well, people might want to put a few fruits and vegetables in here. So let's put this tiny little drawer. Really irks me. But thank you for that tip, Anne-Marie.
No worries. I did see from someone that my link to the farmers markets didn't work, so I will try pasting that again. And other than that, I don't see any other questions. And I do just want to thank again our speakers, Jenna Umbriak, Cheryl Collin, Anna Rose Kennedy, for a really great presentation. Thanks to all of you for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedules to meet with us and talk about this topic. We will share out the link to the recording and again, links to our websites. But thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for hosting us.
Thanks, everyone.
I'm just putting the link of where the farmers market brochure can be found in case you're just having a problem with opening the PDF. So there you go.